Well, of course, one of the barriers for the energy conversion and for our growing population is the speed with which Australia can roll out new infrastructure. Right now, it's suggested that the headlong expansions for road, for rails, for electricity infrastructure, that it's crowded out other efforts to build more homes here in Australia. So where's the balance when the need for better infrastructure and a planned build program that will see projects delivered on time and within budget, and especially within government's budget? It's a scenario happening not just here, but around the world right now. Well, Mike Dorrell is the chief executive and founder of one of the world's largest infrastructure investors, the US-based Stonepeak. He's an Australian, and Mike Dorrell started with Macquarie, then with Blackstone. Now Stonepeak manages more than $100 billion worth of infrastructure projects and has operations in 61 countries. And I spoke with Mike Dorrell a little earlier.
You know, I've been over in the US 25 years or so. It's a very similar issue with state governments there as to what it is here. No one's got enough money to upgrade the necessary infrastructure upgrades that are necessary. So what you're experiencing here in Australia, very similar to what we see in the US.
Okay, so then the question is, who should upgrade infrastructure? Should it be the private sector? Or should it be that governments themselves get involved? How does it work best?
Look, it's a policy decision, of course, and there are trade-offs. My observation is that there's often a toll, of course, involved if it's done by the private sector, and so that's a decision for voters and a decision for government. But I'd also note that often things get done quicker and get done better, and certainly you have more of it when it is funded by the private sector. I get back here to Australia and I compare it with all these other countries I travelled to around the world, and here in Sydney we've got the most beautiful looking airport. We've got the most beautiful road that comes from the airport. My folks live out Penrith way. We've got the most beautiful roads out there, and every time I come back there seems to be another road. Now you pay some tolls for that, but I must say, it's more options, I think, for the consumers and for the citizens, and I personally am a big fan, but ultimately it's a call for government and a call for voters.
Okay, so the way in which you operate is that you've got a whole pool of capital sitting out there. Investors put their money in to you. You then invest in infrastructure, or you build infrastructure. Mm-hmm. The question is, when you're using those investors' money, how you prioritise which infrastructure projects that you will back. How do you work that out in your own mind? Is it done by sector? Is it done by opportunity by opportunity? How do you work it out?
Look, we got three sectors that we focus on, and I think most infrastructure investors would say this. There's digital, and huge big tailwinds behind digital, of course. It's energy and energy transition. Again, huge tailwinds behind energy transition at the moment. And it's transport and logistics. And once again, huge tailwinds there. You've got a lot of dilapidated traditional transport infrastructure, but you've also got a realignment of supply chains with all the geopolitical stuff that's going on at the moment. So big themes there. So we really look across those sectors, and you've really got two thoughts. You're trying to get the best risk return you can for your investors, and you're trying to diversify. They're basically the thoughts there. But I will say this to your sort of thematic here. When government gets behind a privatisation or even better, the building of new infrastructure, there's a lineup around the corner in terms of infrastructure investors who want to get involved in that. So there's a lot of money and a lot of funding for traditional public infrastructure that private capital can get involved in.
So let's go back to where we kind of started this whole program, was talking about the need for giant data centres. And even in the United States now, the call for some of those, big tech companies trying to invest directly into nuclear energy, right? So in other words, the need for more energy actually almost aligns with the change in data centres, the AI that's coming, the demand for more electricity. So the question is there almost an infinite sort of demand, if you like, for an investor such as you to invest in data centres, to invest in electricity generation right now?
There is huge demand. And look, one thing that's really exciting to me about the big tech companies getting involved in energy policy is that maybe the biggest hold up to energy build out, certainly in the US, perhaps here in Australia. I must admit, it's been a while since I lived here, so a little less familiar. But it's energy policy, okay? Like trying to get a new transmission grid extension built it takes 10 years to get that approved. Trying to get a new power plant built, very, very, very difficult. And politically, you tend to have the right side of politics saying, let's fix up permitting reform. You tend to have the left side of politics saying, hang on, this needs to be everything needs to be sort of green and environmentally sound, and we want to sort of slow it all down, and they tend to oppose broad-based permitting reform. The tech companies have tended to be more supportive of the left side of politics. And so I think you've got this coming together where politically you're starting to get alignment on permitting reform to allow these things to get done more quickly. And then secondly, look, AI is considered a national security issue. It's a bipartisan issue, certainly in the US. I suspect it is here in Australia. And so getting power solved, to me, is becoming much more bipartisan. So I rarely say I'm optimistic about big legislative reform, but I am feeling, in this case, quite good about the prospects of getting energy reform done. And once you do that, there'll be a groundswell of new building of power plants, of transmission infrastructure, and hopefully nuclear.
And then tell me that your return, because you're the investor who'll put your money into, say, a new nuclear plant, but that might not start returning for you for another 8 to 10 years. That's very hard in a stock market listed environment where the need for a return is now. The more patient capital that comes from private equity, from the type of thing that you do, makes it more sort of conducive for that type of investment.
Ross, it's a great observation. Look, public markets are amazing, but there's a lot of things public markets can't do, and particularly sitting there for a number of years waiting for earnings to appear, that's very difficult for our public markets. So I think there's a lot of capital solutions private markets can bring. We're just more flexible. We don't have the quarterly earnings we need to hit. We can sort of sit there, do things off in the corner, and then we can, come out and take it public once all the things that don't work in a public context have been finished. I think the biggest challenge for nuclear has been regulatory, really. Now, people will say it costs more than it should, it takes longer to build than it should, but really the cause of those cost blowouts, the cause of those time blowouts is we've tried to regulate nuclear sort of out of our policy, and so we're seeing a little bit of a change, I think, in that at the moment when nuclear is starting to come back into favour. Certainly in the US, I see some debate in Australia. I'm kind of curious as to where that's up to, but look, if we're going to transition away from hydrocarbons over time, I don't know how we do that without nuclear.
So then come back to the supply side for your investments. You've got right now the best part of $100 billion worth of assets sitting out there, but that is growing, and there's obviously demand for investors coming to the fund wanting to have the patient capital, wanting to actually back these things. So in other words, pension funds or whomever might come in and support your funds, they're prepared to be patient. They're not just waiting for the next quarterly earnings.
You're exactly right. They're trying to match their long-term investor liabilities, their pension fund liabilities that they may not need to pay out for 30, 40 years. They just want to get the best, safest returns they can to match those long-term liabilities. And infrastructure, and frankly other forms of private capital, but infrastructure is very well suited to these longer-term liabilities. It's long-dated assets, it's inflation hedged assets, it's asset-backed. All those things are very appealing to the pension fund.
And frankly, it's also better, the private sector doing this, than putting all of the obligation on the taxpayer, on the government.
I'm biased. I certainly think so. Again, up to voters, up to policymakers. But look, again, I just come back to what Australia's managed to do. You travel around the world and you compare the Sydney infrastructure to what you see in some other cities. It is pretty magical here, and a lot of that is because of the supportive government policy towards private investment in toll roads and airports and things of that nature. So I personally am a supporter.
Mike Dorrell, great to have you on the program, and many thanks for your time.
Hey Ross, thank you. I appreciate it.
There you go, Mike Dorrell there.